Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of The Formula. I'm your host, Trevor Carlson. On The Formula, we break down and explore the elements of achievement in world-class performers. What that means is I sit down with people from all over the world and discuss what challenges, experiences, failures, routines, whatever has really gone into creating their professional or personal success today. This week's guest is painter Brian Rutenberg. On this week's episode, Brian and I discuss his painting process. How does he come up with ideas for his painting, and what does it mean to inspire? How do you work through failures on art projects? Because I imagine that a lot of you artists out there have had some type of failure or rejection, so how do you work through that? We discuss why Brian chose the medium of painting versus any other type of art form, how you can really overcome rejection early on in your career, and the importance of a routine in the creative process and the strength of repetition. I had a lot of fun in this episode with Brian. It was really interesting hearing his point of view and how he, his whole process, how he thinks about these things. And then his stories were just amazing, how he had those rejection experiences and he worked through them and overcame them to become a full-time professional painter like he is now. So let's get this episode started with Brian Rutenberg. On today's episode, I have painter Brian Rutenberg. Brian, thanks for taking the time to show up on the show today. And to kick things off, would you like to share what your painting process looks like?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Trevor. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am a painter, a full-time painter who has been painting for 42 years. I'm 52 now. So I started very young, and I am a landscape painter, although my paintings are not traditional landscapes in that they are fairly brightly colored, and I use a lot of very thick paint, and I sort of, they're more expressive than what you might think of as a traditional landscape. And in terms of work, I have a 1,000 square foot studio on 27th Street in Chelsea and Manhattan. I've been in New York City for 30 years, and I come here every day, Monday through Friday, from about 9:30 to about 5:30. I have 2 kids at home and a wife, and I am a family man. So evenings and weekends are for that. But I have the best job in the world.
As far as your best job, as a full-time painter doing landscape art, I assume that there's some type of process that takes place where you have some type of an idea, or maybe you can even talk about that, how you come up with your ideas for paintings, and how you go from that initial concept or that inspiration to, putting the nail into the wall and hanging the piece up in the studio.
I think I would start with the word inspire. You always hear that word bandied about when it comes to the arts, inspiration. And it's important to remind myself that the word inspire means to inhale, which refers to the body, not the mind. Art enters us on the animal level through our pores. And it's very important to remember that although painting is an intellectual experience, you can't have thinking without first having feeling. So it's very important for an artist to let us feel first. So when I think about feeling, I think about the landscape in which I grew up, along the coast of South Carolina, the South Carolina Lowcountry, between Charleston and Myrtle Beach, where I was born. And that landscape, that very humid, very tangled vines, slow ancient rivers, moss hanging out of trees, that's the landscape in which I learned how to see. And in order for me to see it fully in the way that I want to express it, it's important that I not be there, if that makes any sense. Because the idea in the paintings is not to paint what it looked like, but what it feels like to be there. What is it like to be there, the experience? Anyone can take a photograph of it and show you exactly what the details look like. But to paint it, you almost have to sit with your back to the window and learn how to be alone, which is a very important element in the arts, solitude. Creativity thrives on solitude. And one of the most important things that a painter can possess is a locked door. Locking your door not only keeps the world out, but it contains you inside, where self-awareness, the enemy of art, can be rinsed away. It's easier to fall in love with the sound of your voice while no one else is listening. So the important thing is to spill everything out behind your locked door and then go back and fix it later. And the fun thing about what I do is I can tinker with stuff over an 8 or 9 month span and only put it out into the world when it's absolutely what I intended. So I have all of that time alone to be in here in this laboratory almost, making these things that I make. And it's the coolest thing in the world because, art really serves no practical purpose. It doesn't heat homes or purify water. Art, in a sense, is like a ship in a bottle. It doesn't do anything but be itself. But like a ship in a bottle, a painting is the most like itself. It is the evidence of someone putting a brush to canvas. So it automatically kind of keeps you in the present tense. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that we can do as artists, is to remind people to be present and to experience things right here and right now without necessarily having a narrative or a story, to just have experience. Pleasure itself is a form of content.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff there I kind of want to dive into, but it sounds like so if I'm understanding you correctly, I'm going to try to translate a little. You go somewhere, you see something, you have some type of inspiration by being present at this place. Then you go back to your solitude, or you're behind a locked door somewhere, and then you really think about how it felt to be there and what feelings you get, how it appears in your mind, and then you almost try to recreate that on the canvas.
Right. You just sort of, again, be present, and you put paint, which is this gooey, sticky stuff, on a flat surface, and you try to make a new experience right there in front of you. And then hopefully when the viewer stands in front of it, they too can have that experience. So in a way, it's a kind of telepathy. It's a joining of minds, just as it would be if you were listening to Bob Dylan or if you were reading a novel. You are communing with the artist, and you are, in a sense, standing in their shoes and looking through their eyes. And that's a beautiful moment of empathy, of kind of reaching out and trying to join consciousness with someone else. And that's what I hope to do, is create that very present kind of spark of experience for the viewer. So it really has nothing to do with remembering what something looked like, but in a way trying to possess it in that moment with my materials. That's why practice is so very important in anything, but in my experience, certainly in painting. Showing up here every single day and staying here regardless of the results. It doesn't have to be good. All it has to do is continue. And I think that's true for a lot of things. You have to show up. That's the most important part. People, expect perfection and high performance, and all of the upsides that go with any endeavor. But it's also important to remember that it's okay to screw up, to fumble, and to fail, and to mess up. That's the good stuff, and that's the stuff that allows you to express something in fully dimensional terms, not just the upside, but the downside as well, to have that full range of experience.
Do you have a story or an experience where you've had, your in your using your words, where you maybe fumbled through a painting or a project, and then maybe how you worked through it and finished the painting?
Yeah, I mean, being an artist is essentially highly orchestrated failure in a way. 95% of what I do never sees the light of day. It gets scraped over or completely obliterated, and then I go back into it. So it is a long struggle, but it's a struggle that I set up for myself. And, in the late 80s, when I was just starting out, I was sending out slides, as all artists will know, to galleries to try to get my work seen and represented. And every letter, every packet would get returned with a rejection letter. And I have a pillowcase here in my studio full of rejection letters from those days. And to remind me of the importance of failing. And I remember one day on my answering machine, which we had back then, there was a message from a very prominent dealer downtown in Soho asking me to come to the gallery in person. And I thought, oh my gosh, this could be the big break. They want to meet me in person. Maybe they want to represent me. So I got a haircut. I took a shower. I put on a luxurious black turtleneck, and I took the train down to Soho. And then I walked into the gallery and bounded up to the front desk with a big grin on my face. And I was greeted by this dour little gallery attendant, also wearing a luxurious black turtleneck. And he held out my slides like you would kind of a dirty sock. And affixed to the slides was a yellow Post-it note that said, "Don't let this guy come near me." And it was signed by the gallery owner. And I was completely humiliated. And I took my slides and just sort of slinked out of the gallery back to my studio. And then about 10 years later, that same dealer approached me asking me to represent my work. And this is after I had already had, a great deal of exposure, and I was kind of on my way. And I did what any self-respecting artist would do. I wrote, "Go F yourself" on a yellow Post-it note and sent it to him.
That's a great retribution story.
Yeah, it felt good at the time.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that would feel like, though, getting that initial rejection. Though that'd be like, oh man, damn it. I thought I made it, and now they're telling me I gotta go. So
public humiliation is quite powerful.
Yeah.
But again, if you're not willing to do that, then you definitely should find another thing to do. Do not be an artist. The writer Charles Bukowski, when asked how to become a writer, would always respond, "Quit now, you suck." And if that was enough to discourage or to offend somebody, then they should find something else to do. It is an extremely hard job, but it's also the best job in the world. And again, it is like a ship in a bottle, because a lousy day for a doctor is someone dies, and a lousy day for me is the wrong tone of pink. So you got to put it in perspective there. But again, what we do as artists is critical in that we offer the world slow seeing and slow thinking. Our product is anti-speed. And I think in this world that is obsessed with velocity, slow seeing and slow thinking is one of the most valuable things one person can offer another. So I'm very proud to say that and to devote my life to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you articulated that very well. So I have two questions. I'll ask them both now, but okay. Maybe we can tackle them one at a time. So one is, I really want to know why painting, what got you into painting versus like any other form of art or creativity. And then I'd also kind of like to know, like, if you go back to that moment where you kind of faced that rejection, because I think that, in a lot of people I've interviewed, there's this pivotal moment that seems to happen. At the time, they don't necessarily know it's that moment, but they have kind of a choice, and that's to either like continue or fold up shop. So whichever one of those you'd like to tackle first. I kind of want the answer to both, but
okay. I'll take them in order, Trevor. I think the first question in terms of why painting, I remember as throughout my entire childhood, my mother would place a crystal bowl on my bedside table, and in it, in the springtime, she would float 3 camellia blossoms cut from a bush in our front yard. And I would lay there on my pillow as I fell asleep, and also as I woke up in the morning, staring at those 3 blossoms floating on the water. And they would slowly spin and bump into the sides of the glass and into each other. And I realized decades later that she was teaching me how to see. Looking is gathering information. I look before I cross the street so I don't get hit by the M11 bus. But seeing is contemplation. And I realized that my mother was teaching me how to see. She created all of the conditions necessary for an experience that had no meaning whatsoever. Yet it filled me with this kind of burning rage to live. And I had to do something with that feeling, with that burning rage for life. And I found that I had a proficiency for drawing as a kid, 4 or 5 years old, and then painting a little bit later on. And I was fortunate to have parents that sort of gave me the leeway and the freedom, or the permission is a better word, to sit there at the kitchen table and make these little paintings. They were little paintings of the beach because we grew up, again, in Myrtle Beach by the ocean. And they would bring me materials and just kind of get out of my way, in a sense, because they could see that I was, so devoted and so willing to put in the time to make these things. I was terrible at sports. Although I'm 6'3" now, I was horrible at basketball in high school. I was always the last one to get picked for clubs. I was relatively shy and kind of a loner. I still am, really. But I was suited for this thing, which requires a lot of time alone. So I had a feel for paint. I grew up in the marshes of the Low Country, and I remember digging for clams with my feet. And you plunge your foot down into the cold mud, you feel for a shell, and then you reach down with your hands and you pull up the clam. And there's something about that repetitive process and something about the mud itself, the feel of it in your hands, that brought me great pleasure. And in a sense, that's what oil paint is. It is crushed rock mixed with liquefied fat and smeared on a flat surface. So it's very primitive, which I dig. I like that idea. It's been around for 1,000 years. And I like that I can be, one tiny little blip on this broader roadmap of painting. So that's something that just ignited me as a kid and still continues. And I think in terms of the other one was about the pivotal moment. I think I went to grad school here in New York City at the School of Visual Arts from 87 to 1989. And I remember in 1989, toward the end of that 2-year program, we went down to a loft down on the Bowery, to a very famous painter's loft, with the critic, Clement Greenberg, who's a very well-known critic in the 1950s and 60s. He's no longer with us now. And I remember he gathered a small group of us together, and he said, who here is a painter? And my hand shot up instinctively. I'm a painter. And then he looked at me and he sort of pulled his glasses down a little lower on his nose, and he said, okay, you can leave the room. And I was so embarrassed, so humiliated, and it was just quiet. And I kind of, made my way over to the door. I didn't know whether to cry or to be angry. I had this big lump in my throat, and I just walked down the stairs down to the street. And by the time I got to the bottom steps, I realized that I had been trying too hard all along. And one of the things an artist must realize is trying too hard makes lousy work. It's important to remember that good painting doesn't look like art. It looks like work. And that's what you want to strive for, the notion of work. And to do that, I think it's important not to try too hard, to let things happen, to let mistakes happen, and to learn how to improvise with them and go with them. So I think that moment at the bottom of the steps in a loft on the Bowery in New York City in 1989 was the moment I gave myself permission to stop trying so hard and to simply show up every single day and make my stuff, make my work. There's that great Stephen Sondheim lyric from Sunday in the Park with George when he says, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And I think that's the most beautiful thing, that we show up in our studios and we make something where there was nothing. And that is the neatest thing to me. So I think that was one moment I would refer to, Trevor.
Yeah, man, it sounds like you've been through a couple of those moments, as both of those that you shared sounded like challenging situations of their own. If somebody approached you as an artist and maybe they were at the beginning of their career and they faced some type of rejection or a challenge like this, what advice would you give them?
I would say the most important thing is to be kind. Kindness is the source of art, because ultimately you are not painting a picture. You're painting, in a sense, yourself. You're putting yourself there. So it's important to have an open and generous heart. Generosity is really the kernel of art. It is a form of gratitude. So I think kindness, be kind to people, because that always is reflected in the work that you do. You have to become your own best friend. And that was told to me very long ago. Because when you do that, you're in a way impervious. John Lennon said, "No one can harm you, feel your own pain." So I think if you're willing to own your own pain, to own your failure, and to look at it not as a detriment, not as something to avoid, but as an integral part in the broad spectrum of being a human being, it's okay, to give yourself that leeway. It's okay to screw up. It's okay to fail and feel that. So be your own best friend, because really nobody can touch you when you are your own best friend. So that's the best advice I can give to a young painter. And also, when in doubt, use orange or green.
Well, all right, I got to ask why. Yeah. Why orange or green?
Because they're secondary colors. They are very useful colors to use in contrast to other things. For instance, green and purple next to each other is pure magic, just as pink and blue together. There are certain combinations of colors, but green and orange are colors that people don't normally think of. They're highly useful colors that are really not on the tips of many painters' palettes, I find.
Interesting. I'm not much of a painter myself. My art form is mostly writing, so I can't use green or orange, but maybe I'll think about that as I'm visualizing what I'm going to write next.
You could describe apricots and limes.
Perfect. I'll make a note of that. That's actually not a terrible idea. So when you sit down to paint, I assume that there's, like, when you talk about being in solitude, I assume there's some type of optimal, like, mental state that you try to get yourself into.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
Yes. Any creative person, or really anybody, I think would maybe acknowledge the notion of routines, that routines bring a source of comfort, and creative people, certainly myself, rely on such routines. I wake up at 7:03 every morning. I make breakfast for my kids and I get them ready for school. Then I go to the gym for 25 minutes and I do a little bit of cardio, a little bit of lifting. Then I have oatmeal and coffee with a couple of actor buddies on the Upper West Side. And then I get here about 9:30 or 10, and I spend about the first hour in my studio on paperwork and correspondence. It involves a lot of letter writing, and I like to write as well. And then while I'm doing that, I have my computer terminal set up as such I can look over the top and see the wall on the opposite side and see the painting I was working on the night before. And as I write, I can think about what I might do that day as I'm writing. And then I stand up and I do about 15 minutes of stretching, which is very important in the arts because a painting is a physical activity. I'm lugging big, heavy canvases around. And I stretch. So I have a couple of stretches that I have come up with. And then I begin work, usually with very rudimentary kind of manual things like laying out the palette and then getting the brushes ready and the materials. And then I get to work. And I find that the majority of my time is really spent sitting in a battered rocking chair looking at what I'm doing. The actual application of paint is really not that long in the course of a day. It's the looking part that counts, and the contemplating what you're doing. And that just comes from experience, from having done it a long time. I kind of know instinctively when something is wrong, and I know when I've hit it on target. And it's always the yearning to get to that point where the thing clicks, which is really hard to do in a painting. And I always go back to the wisdom of Winnie the Pooh, who said, I think it was to Igor, what he likes best is not getting honey, but the moment just before he gets honey. So if I can sustain that moment, then I've got something. It's the yearning that counts.
That's a really interesting routine. How did you kind of piece that together?
That's just trial and error. In the beginning, I found that I do a lot of painting, and not a lot of thinking and looking. And then later, as I get older, it's more a little bit of painting and then sitting back and looking. So it's really a flip-flop of those two things. And again, the great part is I do about 2 solo shows a year. I show in cities all over the country, and I spend about 6 or 7 months on each show. So I have about 10 or 12 paintings going at the same time, and I basically rotate them around the room according to the rate at which they dry. And I work on one painting then I move it, and then I work on the next painting. So I work on everything all at once. And then at the end of that period, I hopefully have, a cohesive show. And then I go to the opening and meet wonderful people. It's really a fun thing. It's the only job I've ever had. I've had, restaurant, washing pots and pans and busboy and bellhop and all that stuff. But other than that, a little bit of gallery work when I first moved to New York. Other than that, this has been pretty much it. And I did it because I learned how to live very frugally, so that I could spend the most time in my studio working and the least amount of time on day gigs, earning money. And I sort of set my life up in that way. And then things started to happen slowly, very slowly. But again, I showed up every single day. It didn't matter if it was good. It just mattered if it kept going. And I had some, luck, and I was in the right place at the right time. And I had a lot of help. I had a lot of great mentors and people. You don't do this alone. You have help. And that goes back to the word generosity that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That notion of being generous, of putting yourself out there, of extending yourself, and of trying to help, and also allowing people to help you. I think those are important things, not only in the visual arts, but I think in everything.
Yeah. So speaking of mentors, I'm assuming at this point in your career that there are probably some artists out there that you mentor or help out. What would you say are the, some of the bigger struggles that, earlier artists have, and how do you kind of help them work through those challenges or struggles or whatever you want to call them?
I think one of the problems in starting out is you're taught in art school to continually grow and evolve, and those are tricky words. There is great strength in repetition and doing the same thing over and over and over again. That's how you get really good at stuff. And they don't talk about that in school. They don't teach that in art school. I think it was Duke Ellington said, "The wise musicians are those who play what they can master." I like the notion of practicing something for a long, long time. I'm fascinated by jobs like traveling salespeople or birthday party magicians, people who show up and do the same gig over and over and over again till they perfect it, to the point where they can just show up and then click, they're doing the thing. That's the part that I think that young artists sometimes lose sight of, trying to constantly be good. Another quote is Steve Martin, the great comedian, said, "It's easy to be great, it's hard to be good." So the notion of consistency, of just trying to be good, is hard enough. And the way that I sort of try to get that message out and to be of help to the most people possible is a series of YouTube videos that I've self-produced and put out for the last 6 years. They're called Brian Rutenberg Studio Visits, and you can find them on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, and there are 61 episodes. I release one every other month, and it's basically me sitting in my studio in a wooden chair in front of a camera, just talking about my painting life. And I go through practical struggles, like how do you set up a studio? How do you approach a gallery? How do you put a show together? How do you deal with rejection letters? And then things more philosophical, like how does one, manufacture their own way of seeing the world? And then I put a little art history in there and a little bit of humor, and the response has been wonderful. I get emails every day from all over the world, and I realize that we are not alone. There is a big world out there of people trying to do the same thing that I'm trying to do. And if I can be of help in any way to show them that, yes, you can do this, and yes, it's okay to not be great all the time, then I feel good about that. I think it's important for people to teach. Everybody has something to offer. And if you can articulate that and offer it to others, I think that's the best thing you can do, is to share.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the sharing part of it. And I did happen to check out your YouTube channel. I thought I didn't watch all the videos by any means, but I checked out a couple of them, and I thought there was some really good advice on there. I mean, at least from a non-painter's perspective, it seemed like good advice anyways.
And they're designed, to sort of, I try to, not do artsy fartsy talk. And I try to talk, I try to tell the truth. This is what I'm doing. This is how I do it. And it has struck a nerve out there. And I get letters from non-painters and painters of all ages, of all levels, people doing everything from race car driving to chefs to, conceptual artists. It's fascinating to get that broad a spectrum. So something's clicking, and I think it helps me to be a better painter because, again, that generosity, I think, boomerangs and comes right back to me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like there's this underlying tone through a lot of our conversation. And if I could put a word onto it, it'd be gratitude, right?
Yes.
So it seems like you're very, you're grateful for the challenges and the rejection and the lessons you learned along the way. You're grateful for the way you spend your days. And then it's also, you are trying to share some of that out with people who are also going through some of the same things, or, just maybe need some little nuggets of wisdom to get to the next step on their journey.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. I think that's so very important. We are, not to get too broad, but it's. I was talking to my wife Katie last night, and we were saying what a trillion to one lottery it is just to have been born. This perfect balance of chemicals came together to make you, and everybody has something to offer. Everybody has something that glows inside of them, and I think the world needs more people who glow. So I think to do that, you have to be willing to put yourself out there. You have to be willing to tell the truth as you see it, regardless of offending other people. And I think you have to show up every single day, no matter what it is you're doing. You have to show up. That's the most important part.
Yeah, and that can be the hardest part too for a lot of people. I mean, it amazes me when I'm constantly like connecting people, and I'm like, oh, you got to meet this person, you got to meet this person, because I think you guys would hit it off and you could work on this thing together. And it's fascinating to me how many people don't even show up to like that conversation, right? It's like it just seems that if you just show up and you put in effort, a lot of this stuff doesn't have to be that hard. It's just showing up. Right.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be good. That again, I think we're conditioned that every time, a writer sits down or a sculptor takes a chisel and hammer, that it has to be great. It doesn't. It has to continue. That's the most important part. And then every now and then you'll hit that vein and something good comes out of it. But again, you have to be standing around in order to have lightning strike. It's like a bug zapper on your back porch. You very carefully put it in the right place, and it just sits there and waits and waits and waits. And every now and then something gets too close, and then pow, there's that moment of clear thinking. That's what we live for, is that little moment. But they're very rare and far and few between. But when they hit, boy, do they hit. And it ain't going to happen unless you're there on the porch.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more about that. A few months ago, I was giving a talk, kind of talking about, the podcast I'm working on, and then, my business. And at the end of it, they're like, do you have any words of advice or inspiration or anything like that? And I wasn't prepared for it. So I just kind of stood there for a second, and I was like, you know what? Like, pick something that you like or that you want to do, and then just go suck at it for as long as you can.
Right.
And everyone kind of looked at me like, what? I'm like, you know what?
Yeah.
I started taking salsa lessons, I don't know, about a year ago. And the first 3 or 4 months, it was like, I had people like walk off of like the practice dance floor. They're like, you need to practice a bit more. Yeah. I'm like, you got to be okay with sucking.
Yeah, no, yeah, and you have to be willing to make a total, utter fool of yourself, which I'm I'm willing to do. It's kind of a parallel to what you just said. Go out and suck at it. a very famous painter named Joan Mitchell, who is no longer alive. I got to meet her in a few years before she died I think it was the early 90s. And she said to me, find what you love and let it kill you, which I always thought was really beautiful. Do it all the way or do something else, which I like that notion.
Yeah, it also comes back to like when if you're the type of person that puts that much effort into something, I've noticed this has happened with myself. It wasn't like this when I was younger, but the older I get, I've noticed that I'd like to give my all to a project. So I've had to be very careful and picky about what I get involved in because I know the level of effort I will put in and how much time and effort and possibly like pain is going to be involved with it.
Yes.
So it's really understanding what you want to be involved in and why, and then making conscious choices, picking and choosing your battles or your projects or anything really.
Yes. And I admit I was fortunate in that I kind of got hit by this thing very early in my life. But again, I think the same principles would apply to a broad spectrum of things. While investment bankers were learning that, or while doctors were learning medicine, I was learning how to mix color and how to draw those things. So it really is a process of scholarship, of curiosity. My teacher used to say, if you want to be a painter, you have to know everything. And really his way of telling me you have to stay hungry and you have to stay curious. Curiosity, sometimes I'm asked how to define success. And I think success is too often confused with popularity. It's great to have a show and to sell work and to get a review, but those things don't last. And those things are controlled by other people. The only thing you can control yourself is curiosity and effort. Those two things go in tandem. It doesn't matter what you're doing, but if you have curiosity and you put effort out, those are the things that you control. And I think, it's good to have a little bit of stewardship of what you're doing, to not let everything always rely on someone else's version of your performance. And that goes back to the central theme of being your own best friend, because you're Teflon if you are.
Right. That's a good analogy, Teflon. So let's transition a little bit to talk about your book that you released. It was called A Clear Seeing Place. So what was the process of writing that book like?
It goes back to the videos. There was such a tremendous response, and still is, to the videos, which are continuing. I wanted to sort of put a lot of that content into written form, because sometimes it's nice to sit down with a physical object, a paper book or a Kindle, and then read it in your own voice. So over the course of about a year and a half, I transcribed a lot of the content from the videos, and then I added a lot of things that really wouldn't sound good in video form, which sound better in written form. And I put it all together in 6 very clear sections. And the central theme is really, this is what I do, and this is how I do it. And I go through each of those sections and sort of, unfold the making of a painter in very intimate detail. And there are the rejection things. There's lots of that. There's the elation, the great things, and there's all the stuff in between, the little secret places that one finds, the most important parts of doing something personal. It's very personal, in other words. And I am not a writer. I'm a painter who wrote a book, and I do come from. My dad was an attorney and also a poet, so I've always had a deep appreciation for the written word, and I read a great deal of poetry, and I tend to have I have what's called synesthesia, where you cross senses, and I see color in words. So if someone says a word, I see a color, and so I found that I was very willing to sit down and try to put this into written form. And I basically worked on it for about 2 years, and the most important part, in my opinion, was to have a good editor. I actually had 2 editors work on it, and it was released exactly almost a year ago, October of 2016. And I'm pleased to say it went to #1 in Amazon in two categories actually, and continues this day to be a bestseller on Amazon. And I couldn't be happier because I think, I'm trying to share something and to be of use. And it's very satisfying to kind of see the results of that. So I'm going to work on a second book, which will be out in probably a year, maybe a year and a half. And I'm currently writing that. So kind of when ideas strike, I sit down and I put them out on paper. But it's hard. I really respect what you do. It's very hard to write, I find. It's
been an interesting journey, and congratulations on your book hitting the best top seller list. That's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Writing is an interesting journey because I read what did I read? It was I think it's Anne Lamott or Annie Lamott, something like that.
Sure. Yeah, Anne Lamott.
Yeah, Anne Lamott. I read her book Bird by Bird a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with it?
I know her. I don't know the book.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's called Bird by Bird. It's like lessons on writing and life. It really could be like just lessons on insert whatever your profession is in life. And I was writing up until that point, and I was I'm not a great writer by any means, but she had this concept in the book of shitty first drafts. Uh-huh. And that really like changed everything for me. It was like, that was like the moment where I was like, oh man, just get it out and then you can fix it, just get it out. And actually it's usually not that bad.
Yes. And the key is to spill yourself out and unedited, and don't think. Do first and then think second. And that certainly applies to the visual arts, but I would presume that it would apply to literature as well. Pour yourself out there. It's cool to look at if you look at first drafts of written works. I've seen Stephen King and Pat Conroy, and you look in the margins and you see just ink everywhere, scratches and arrows and omissions. Or if you listen to outtakes of Elvis in the studio, and you realize that those songs, those beautiful crafted songs, they don't just appear. It's the result of thousands of hours of labor, tinkering with little things and trying to get it, to hum. But the mistakes, you realize, how much goes into that. How much of it is just abject failure. And then in the end, what is released is all polished and ready. But it doesn't start that way. So I think, again, giving oneself permission to stumble is a good thing. It's a healthy thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if that was one thing I could go back and change about my childhood education, it would be no, it's okay if you're not good at first. That's supposed to happen.
It's supposed to happen. And we instill that in our kids. My daughter's 14, my son's 13. And we remind them that they everybody likes to tell their kids that they're special and they're unique and they're gifted and talented and all that stuff. And we remind them sometimes that you aren't special, that be a kid. It's okay to screw up. It's okay if you didn't do great on a test. We put no pressure in that way on them. And we find out the reverse happens, that they put the pressure on themselves. So, it's yet to be seen how they'll turn out. But we're pretty darn proud so far because they come home and they get the work done and then they play. So they seem to have the balance there.
Yeah, and play is important as well. It's like if you're not, you should have fun with what you're doing. If there's no enjoyment from what you're doing, then you might want to think about doing something differently.
I couldn't agree more. So many painters, when you see them talking about their work, look like they're getting a flu shot. They look just, dour and upset. And it is the most joyful thing in the world to come here and make things in my studio. A painting might not sell, or it might sell. In the end, it's the joy, the process that is so important. And that's what art can show us, that pleasure is enough. We continually seek meaning in everything. And sometimes the meaning is just in the simple enjoyment of an experience. Walking barefoot on the grass in the yard in the summer night, that's a beautiful thing. And sometimes what poets show us is that's enough. The whole world, the whole universe can revolve around that, for a moment. And it's okay to let those things just be what they are, to not constantly try to find meaning in everything.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I want to ask you, this is a little bit off, well, maybe it's not quite off topic, but is there, like, you've had a decently long, successful career. What piece of work, and it doesn't have to be a painting, but what piece of work out of your life or your career are you most proud of?
In terms of the ones that I make, there was a painting called Algonquin, which I made in 1999. And it was a pivotal painting. And it was quite large in scale. And the word Algonquin refers to the national forest up in Ontario, where I go a lot to kayak and to make drawings. And it was just a deeply personal painting. It was one of the paintings where I stopped trying too hard, what I talked about a few minutes ago. And I just allowed myself to be there in my studio, making marks and not overthinking it. And I think the whole thing came together in the right balance that I was after for a long, long time. So it takes way more than 10,000 hours, to quote the Malcolm Gladwell dictum, to do this. And I've put in a lot of time. And every now and then it clicks, it pays off. And I think that painting was one example of that. But in terms of others, I really don't consider them painting by painting. I look more at single shows, and I'm very proud of certain shows. There have been a number of them in New York City. I have one coming up in Charlotte, North Carolina in May. And I really look at it that way. It's a more of a close focus on what I'm doing at the moment rather than a too forward looking.
Awesome. I'm gonna have to check out that painting. It's because I've seen you quote the Algonquin one before on some of your stuff. So I'll have to check that out. So that kind of wraps up the first part of our show, and this is kind of the normal, like, rapid fire type of questions. I feel like we accurately covered the daily routine part, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that, unless there's anything that you'd like to add.
No, I think I touched on the main things, Trevor.
Yeah, I felt like you really hit the nail on the head on that one. So that brings me to the next question, which would be, what do you think is the most impactful book that you've read?
I would say it would be The Elephant Man by Sir Frederick Treves, which was made into an excellent movie by David Lynch. And it's a short book. It's part medical journal and part poetry. And it's one human being empathizing with another human being. And I think it's the most tender book. And it shows, like the importance of beauty, of living a beautiful life, regardless of what's on the outside, of trying to be oneself and trying to be kind. So empathy and The Elephant Man. The Elephant Man is the book I would choose.
I've never heard of that one, so I'll have to add it to my list.
And check out the movie, Trevor.
All right. Is it on Netflix or anything like that?
It should be on Netflix. If not, you can probably order it for nothing on Amazon. And it came out in the 80s, and it's filmed in black and white. But it's a gorgeous story.
Perfect. I'll have to check that out. I'm always looking for the next good movie to watch. So
okay, I think you'll like it.
So that brings us to like wrapping up the show, man. I really appreciate you having you on. I feel like I learned a lot. I have a lot of takeaways just from discussing your process and your experiences through your life and career. So, and you kind of covered what was next. You have another book coming out in about a year, and you're still working on selling the one that you have now. So I guess I'm just wondering, what message would you like to leave our audience with today?
I would say one of the best quotes I've ever heard is not by a famous painter, but it's by Mike Tyson, the heavyweight boxer. And he said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Don't plan too much. Just allow yourself to get punched in the mouth, because that's how you learn stuff.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Brian. I know I enjoyed it, and I had a lot of notes and takeaways for me to apply to my own creative process, whether that's in writing or creating this podcast. Now, if you think you would like or you would enjoy hearing more podcasts from us over here at Helix Academy and the Formula Podcast, or you'd like to get articles, blog posts, check out some of our new classes that just came out, go ahead and head over to helixacademy.co and sign up for our newsletter so you can get all those updates just delivered right to your inbox. So that's a wrap for this week's show. My name is Trevor Carlson, and I look forward to you tuning in or stopping by next week. This episode of The Formula was produced by Helix Academy, and the music was provided by the artist known as Moods. Make sure and check him out on Facebook or Spotify. That's MOODS.